The ship was small and ugly, and everyone on Tyrolo's station knew it. The UNS outstretched hand came through the gateway with its engines coughing and its hull scarred from a journey that had taken 11 months, and the moment it appeared on the station's sensors, the broadcasts began. "The Deathworld primates have learned to stumble between stars," said a Velith commentator, his mandibles clicking with amusement as his show went live to trillions of viewers across the galactic network. Inside the ship, Ambassador Kavya Naidu straightened her uniform and looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the observation window, and she told herself that today would be different, that today humanity would finally be seen as something more than a joke. She was wrong. Tyrolo's station was a megastructure the size of a small moon, built 4,000 years ago by the Galactic Concord, a coalition of 312 species that governed most of the known galaxy. And when Kavya stepped off her ship and onto the docking platform, she was met by a delegation of alien diplomats who towered over her in every possible way. The Velith were insectoid creatures with shimmering carapaces and psychic abilities that let them communicate without words, and they looked at her the way a person might look at a dog that had learned to open a door, impressed in a small way, but never threatened. The Dreven were tall reptilian beings with scaled skin and eyes like polished amber, and they at least had the decency to hide their amusement behind formal greetings. The Rithani were something else entirely, silicon-based life forms that looked like living crystal formations, ancient beyond measure, and they said nothing at all, because they had not spoken to anyone in 300 years. Kavya walked through corridors that hummed with energy she could not understand, past technology that made everything on Earth look like children's toys, and she held her head high because that was all she had. The Grand Assembly Hall was a vast chamber carved from a single piece of dark stone, and it could hold representatives from every species in the Concord, and when Kavya entered, she felt very small. She stood at the central platform and presented humanity's petition for membership in the Galactic Concord, and she spoke clearly and carefully about Earth's achievements, their science, their art, their resilience, their journey from caves to the stars. The hall was quiet when she finished, and for one beautiful moment she thought they were moved. Then the laughter started. It did not come from one species or one section of the hall. It rolled through the chamber like a wave, a galactic chorus of amusement at the idea that these soft, short-lived creatures from a violent little world could sit among the elder races of the galaxy. The Concord's presiding officer, a Velith elder named Thavan, raised one of his 4 arms for silence, and when the laughter faded, he spoke with a voice that carried the weight of millennia. "Your petition is acknowledged, Ambassador Naidu, and it is denied," he said, and his tone was not cruel. It was worse than cruel, it was kind, the way one is kind to a child who asks to drive a starship. "Humanity is classified as a Tier 9 pre-civilization," Thavan continued. "You lack the prerequisites for membership, no post-scarcity economy, no unified planetary government, no psionic potential, no megastructure engineering, and no demonstrated capacity for integration with galactic society." Kavya stood very still and felt the eyes of 312 species on her, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say that would change anything in that room. Later that day, the Velith hegemony's most popular broadcast network aired a special program about humanity, and they called it Apes with Engines, and it featured Velith scientists explaining in detail why humans were biologically inferior. Too fragile, too short-lived, too emotional, too dependent on crude mechanical technology to compensate for their natural weaknesses. The program was watched by trillions, and it spawned jokes and memes that spread across the galaxy like fire. And on every station and every world and every ship, humanity became the punchline. Kavya watched some of the broadcast from her quarters on the outstretched hand, and her aide, a young officer named Marcus, asked her if she wanted to file a formal protest. "No," she said quietly, and she turned off the screen. The journey home took 11 months again, and Kavya spent most of it in silence, sitting in her quarters and thinking about the look on Thavan's face when he denied the petition. Not hatred, not anger, just gentle, absolute dismissal, as if humanity was not even worth the effort of being feared. When the outstretched hand finally returned to Earth and docked at the orbital station above Geneva, Kavya was met by reporters and officials and politicians who wanted to know what had happened, and she told them everything. The laughter, the denial, the broadcast, the classification. The world reacted with a storm of emotions: anger, humiliation, defiance, despair. And for a few weeks it seemed like humanity might simply turn inward and forget the stars. But Kavya Naidu was not finished. She requested an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly, and every nation sent their representative, and the hall was packed and silent when she took the stage. She did not give a long speech, and she did not beg for sympathy, and she did not call for revenge. She simply said, "They measured us by what we are, and by that measure they are right. We are small, we are fragile, we are young, and we are alone in a galaxy that thinks we are nothing." She paused, and the silence was so deep that you could hear the hum of the air systems. "They should have measured us by what we do when we are angry." The hall erupted, and within 6 months, something happened that no one, not the conquered, not the Velith, not even the most optimistic human, had ever thought possible. Every nation on Earth signed the Terran Solidarity Compact. Every government, every military, every research institution, every corporation, every resource, all of it, unified under a single directive for the first time in human history. They called it Project Prometheus, and its goal was simple: become something the galaxy could not ignore, could not dismiss, could not laugh at. The details were classified at the highest level, and the only thing the public knew was that humanity had decided, collectively and furiously, that the next time they went to the stars, nobody would be laughing. Far away, on Tyrolo's station, a driven intelligence analyst named Sithar sat in his small office and reviewed the data from humanity's visit, and something about it bothered him. He had spent his career studying emerging species, and he had seen dozens of Tier 9 civilizations come to the conquered and be turned away, and every single one of them had reacted the same way. They either collapsed into despair or they launched a desperate and futile war. Humanity had done neither. They had gone quiet, and that quiet frightened Sithar in a way he could not fully explain. He filed a report with the Conquered's Intelligence Bureau, and he marked it as high priority, and in it he wrote, "Recommend reevaluation of Species 7742 designation. Humans demonstrate anomalous response to adversity. Standard Tier 9 behavioral models do not apply. Threat assessment uncertain." The report was read by a junior clerk, marked as low relevance, and filed away in a database where it would sit untouched for 40 years. Sithar stared at his screen for a long time after he submitted it, and he thought about the look in Kavya Naidu's eyes when the laughter had washed over her. Not broken, not beaten, not even angry in the way he expected. It was the look of someone making a promise. And that, more than anything else in his long career, was what kept Sithar awake at night. The galaxy called it the human quiet, and for 40 years nobody paid it much attention. In the beginning, a few conquered analysts noticed that Earth had stopped sending diplomatic signals, and they noted it in their reports the way someone might note a change in the weather, interesting but unimportant. By the 5th year, the Velith Hegemony's intelligence division officially downgraded humanity from monitored species to inactive pre-civilization, and the file was moved to a low-priority archive where it gathered digital dust alongside thousands of other forgotten worlds. By the 10th year, humanity had become nothing more than an old joke, something elder diplomats mentioned at galas when they wanted to get a laugh, a cautionary tale about the foolishness of Deathworld species who reached too far too fast. "Remember the apes with engines," they would say, and the room would chuckle. And then they would move on to more important things. The galaxy was vast and busy and full of real problems. Trade disputes between the Velith and the Dreven, territorial negotiations with the Outer Rim colonies, the ongoing mystery of the precursors who had built the galaxy's oldest infrastructure before vanishing 12,000 years ago. And nobody had time to worry about one small species on one small world orbiting one unremarkable yellow star. Nobody except Sithar. The old Dreven analyst had retired from active intelligence work, but he kept his access to the long-range sensor networks, and every few months he would check the readings from Sol's system, and every few months he would frown at what he saw. The readings were strange. Not alarming, not dramatic, just strange in a way that made the scales on the back of his neck rise, small fluctuations in Sol's energy output, faint electromagnetic signatures that did not match any known natural phenomenon, and a gradual dimming of the star itself that was so subtle it could easily be dismissed as sensor drift. Most analysts did dismiss it, and when Sithar raised the issue at a quarterly review meeting, his former colleagues smiled politely and told him that stars dimmed sometimes, and that he should enjoy his retirement. Sithar did not enjoy his retirement. He went home and pulled up every piece of data he could find on humanity, and he read it all again from the beginning, and the more he read, the more the feeling in his gut grew stronger. Because inside Sol's system, behind the wall of silence, humanity was doing something that would have terrified the entire Conquered if they had known about it. Project Prometheus had branched into dozens of sub-projects, each one more ambitious than the last, and the Terran Solidarity Compact had turned Earth into a single machine with one purpose: to become something the galaxy had never seen before. Project Weaver was the first to bear fruit. A team of physicists and engineers working in a massive underground facility beneath the Sahara Desert took the sensor data that humanity's ships had secretly recorded during their visit to Tyrolo's station and used it to reverse engineer the fundamental principles of Conquered FTL technology. But they did not stop there. Where the Conquered's FTL drives bent space along predictable curves, the Weaver team found ways to fold it, to twist it, to compress it in ways that the Conquered's own scientists had declared impossible. And within 12 years, they had built an engine that was 3 orders of magnitude faster than anything in the galaxy. Project Babel was even more audacious. A team of mathematicians and cryptographers set out to crack the Conquered's quantum-encrypted communications network. And to do it, they invented an entirely new branch of mathematics that had no name and no precedent, and they used it to build decryption algorithms that peeled open the galaxy's most secure channels like paper. By year 15, humanity was listening to every conversation, every transmission, every whispered secret in the Conquered, and nobody knew. But the most important project, the one that consumed 40% of all Terran resources, the one that was so classified that even most of Project Prometheus's leadership did not know its full scope, was Project Anchor. It was led by a physicist named Dr. Emeka Osai, a quiet man from Accra with gentle eyes and a mind that worked in dimensions most people could not imagine, and he had been given a single question to answer: can we control the rules? Not the rules of politics or society, but the rules of reality itself, the fundamental laws that governed how space and time and energy behaved, the deep architecture of the universe that every civilization in the galaxy had always treated as fixed and unchangeable. For 20 years, Emeka and his team worked in a facility buried deep beneath the ice of Antarctica, and they failed again, and they kept failing until the failures themselves began to form a pattern, and the pattern began to whisper something extraordinary. In year 23, they had their first breakthrough. a tiny, unstable bubble of space inside their laboratory where the speed of light was different, where the constants that governed reality had been nudged ever so slightly from their natural values. It lasted for 1/1000th of a second, and it nearly destroyed the facility, and Emeka called it the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. In year 30, they could sustain the bubble for a full minute. In year 35, they could shape it, control it, expand it. And in year 38, Emeka Osai sat alone in his office at 3 in the morning, staring at the results of their latest experiment, and he did not move for 3 hours. His colleague, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, found him sitting in the dark and asked him what was wrong, and Emeka looked up at her with eyes that held something between wonder and terror. "We can lock the doors," he whispered. Yuki did not understand what he meant, and Emeka did not explain, because the implications of what he had discovered were so vast and so profound that he needed time to be sure he was not wrong. He was not wrong. Meanwhile, the Dyson swarm was growing. Humanity had begun construction in year 8, millions of solar collectors orbiting Sol in a vast shell, drinking the star's energy and feeding it to the projects below, and they completed it in year 26. 18 years to build a Dyson swarm. The fastest species in the Concord, the crystalline Rithani, had taken 900 years to build theirs, and they were considered engineering prodigies. Concord long-range telescopes detected the dimming of Sol, and a handful of astronomers noted it in their journals, and the official assessment was that the star was entering a natural dimming phase, unusual but not unprecedented. Sithar read that assessment and threw his tablet across the room. He filed another report with the Intelligence Bureau, and this time he did not bother with diplomatic language. He wrote, "They are not quiet because they are weak. They are quiet because they are building. I do not know what they are building, but I know it is not small, and I know we should be afraid." The report was received, reviewed, and filed alongside his first one. Nobody called him back. In the 41st year of silence, the galaxy's attention was elsewhere. The Velith hegemony was celebrating a major trade victory, the Dreven Republic was holding elections, and the Rithani Collective was still saying nothing to anyone as they had done for 3 centuries. So almost nobody noticed when a single ship appeared at the very edge of Tyrolo's station's long-range sensor grid. It was small and sleek and black, and it radiated energy signatures that the station's computers could not classify, and it sat there for exactly 4 minutes, not moving, not transmitting, not doing anything except existing in a way that should not have been possible. The duty officer who spotted it tried to get a closer scan, but before the sensors could lock on, the ship moved. It did not accelerate. It simply was in one place, and then it was in another place, and then it was gone, and the sensor logs showed a transit speed that the computer flagged as an error because nothing in the known galaxy could move that fast. The duty officer filed a report and classified it as a sensor malfunction, because that was easier than believing what the data was telling him. Sithar never saw that report. But if he had, he would not have been surprised. He would have simply nodded his old scaled head and said what he had been saying for 40 years, that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake when it laughed at the apes, and that the bill for that laughter was about to come due. And somewhere deep beneath the Antarctic ice, Emeka Osai stood before a machine the size of a cathedral, and he watched it hum with power that could reshape the fabric of reality itself, and he smiled. Because the door was almost ready, and humanity was about to show the galaxy what happened when you locked the locksmiths out. They came back on a Tuesday. Nobody in the Concord would remember the day of the week, of course, because alien calendars did not work that way, but the humans remembered, and they chose the day deliberately because there was something wonderfully ordinary about a Tuesday. It was not dramatic. It was not symbolic. It was just a day, and that was the point. 12 ships dropped out of whatever form of travel they were using and appeared in the space around Tyrolo's station, as if they had always been there. And every alarm on the station screamed at once. They were not large ships. Each one was perhaps half the size of a standard Concorde cruiser, but the energy readings coming off them made the station's chief engineer choke on his morning drink and call his superior with shaking hands. "Each of those ships is outputting more power than our entire home fleet," he said, and his superior told him to run the numbers again, and he did 3 times, and the numbers did not change. The ships were beautiful in a way that made the Concorde's finest vessels look like toys, smooth and dark, and radiating a quiet hum that the station's sensors could feel but not identify, as if reality itself was vibrating at a slightly different frequency around them. They were not warships. The lead ship broadcast a single message on an open channel, in perfect Concorde standard, and the voice was calm and warm and polite in a way that somehow made it more frightening. "This is the Terran diplomatic vessel Prometheus to Tyrolo's station. We are here to present a petition to the Galactic Concorde. We request docking clearance and an audience with the Grand Assembly." The station's command center went silent, and then someone said "the humans," and someone else said a word in Velith that did not translate well but roughly meant, "that cannot be right." And then everyone started talking at once. Docking clearance was granted, because nobody could think of a reason to refuse it, and because everyone was too stunned to think clearly. Ambassador Rayan Naidu stepped off the lead ship and onto the same docking platform where his grandmother had stood 42 years ago, and he was a tall man with dark eyes and a calm face, and a suit that was simple and black and somehow more impressive than all the jeweled robes of the Concorde's elder diplomats. He was met by a hastily assembled delegation that included representatives from every major species, and they looked at him the way prey animals look at something they cannot yet identify, not running, not fighting, just very alert. Rayan smiled and shook hands and made small talk and complimented the architecture and did everything a polite diplomat should do, and the entire time, the energy readings from his ships kept climbing. The Grand Assembly was convened in emergency session, and every seat was filled, and the hall that had once echoed with laughter at Kavya Naidu's petition was now filled with a silence so thick it had weight. Rayan took the central platform, the same one his grandmother had stood on, and he looked up at the assembled representatives of 312 species, and he did not look small. "42 years ago, my grandmother stood here and asked to join you," he said, "and you said no, and you laughed, and you called us apes with engines." The silence deepened. "We are not here to ask again," Rayan said. "We are here to present terms." A ripple went through the hall, shock, confusion, anger, and the Velith elder Thavan, ancient now but still presiding, leaned forward and said, "You are a Tier 9 species presenting terms to the Galactic Concorde. Do you understand how that sounds?" "I do," Rayan said pleasantly, "which is why I brought a demonstration." He raised one hand and made a small gesture, and the air in the center of the Grand Assembly Hall split open. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no dramatic sound. Space simply folded, and where there had been empty air there was now a perfect circle of darkness ringed with pale blue light, and through it the assembled delegates could see stars that the station's astronomers would later confirm were in a system 6,000 light-years away. A stable wormhole opened inside a room. The Concorde's greatest physicists had spent millennia proving that stable wormholes were theoretically impossible, and now one was hovering 3 meters above the floor of their most sacred hall, and a human was standing next to it looking patient. The hall erupted in chaos, delegates shouting, guards reaching for weapons, scientists trying to get closer to scan the anomaly, and Rayan simply waited until the noise died down. "That is Demonstration 1, he said. Demonstration 2 was quieter but in many ways more devastating. Rayan activated a display screen and showed the assembly a complete record of their own classified communications from the last 30 years, including private diplomatic channels, military frequencies, and personal messages between heads of state. "We have been listening," he said, and his tone was not threatening. It was almost apologetic, the way someone might apologize for overhearing a conversation through a thin wall. Demonstration 3 happened by accident, or at least it appeared to. A Velith guard, overwhelmed by panic and instinct, raised his weapon and fired a bolt of concentrated plasma directly at Rayan's chest. A shot that carried enough energy to vaporize a light cruiser's hull plating. The bolt hit something invisible a hand's width from Rayan's body and simply stopped, not deflected, not absorbed, just stopped, hanging in the air like a frozen raindrop for a full second before dissolving into nothing. Rayan did not flinch, and he looked at the guard with an expression that was not anger but something closer to patience, and he said, "It is all right, I understand." The guard was removed, and the hall was so quiet that Rayan's next words seemed to echo even though he spoke softly. "We are not here as enemies," he said. "We are here because we have built things that the galaxy needs, and we are here because 42 years ago you told us we were nothing, and we decided to become something." He presented humanity's terms: full Tier 1 membership, the highest classification in the Conquered, and a permanent seat on the ruling council with veto authority, and one additional condition that he described only as the final term. When the Velith Elder Thavan demanded to know what the final term was, Rayan smiled, not a cruel smile, not a triumphant smile, but the smile of someone who knows something that will change everything. "You will hear the final term when the vote is cast," he said, "not before." The assembly dissolved into furious debate, and species that had not spoken to each other in centuries were suddenly huddled together trying to figure out what had just happened and what to do about it. The Rithani Collective, the ancient crystal beings who had maintained their silence for 300 years, suddenly activated their translation matrix and broadcast a single statement to every delegate in the hall. "Listen to them." It was 2 words, and it carried more weight than any speech given in that chamber in 1,000 years, because when the Rithani spoke, the galaxy listened, and the Rithani had not spoken since the last great crisis. Behind closed doors in the private chambers of the Velith Hegemony's delegation, something darker was taking shape. Warlord Ixchara, the commander of the Hegemony's military forces, was already making calls to 11 other species, building a coalition, assembling a fleet. "We cannot allow this," she said to her allies, her mandibles clicking with cold fury. "If we let them sit on the council, we will never be free of them. We must strike Saul while they are still here, while their fleet is away from home." The coalition agreed, and the planning began in secret, and they believed they were being careful. They did not know that humanity was still listening to every word. In his quarters on the Prometheus, Rayan Naidu read the intercepted transmissions from the Velith coalition and poured himself a cup of tea and sat down in a comfortable chair. He was not worried. He was not worried because he knew what was waiting for them in Saul's system, and he knew that the coalition fleet would arrive expecting a battle and would find something they could not fight, could not understand, and could not escape. And far away on Tyrolo's station, old Sithar sat in his quarters and watched the recording of the assembly session for the 4th time, and he focused on Rayan's face at the moment. The plasma bolt had been fired at his chest. The human had not flinched. Not because he was brave, Sithar realized, but because he had known with absolute certainty that the shot could not touch him. That was not confidence. That was knowledge. And Sithar understood then, with the clarity that only comes to the old and the patient, that whatever was coming next had already been decided, and that the galaxy was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. The Coalition fleet was the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the Galactic Concord, and it was glorious and terrifying and absolutely doomed. 14,000 warships from 12 species gathered at the Velith staging point beyond the Kale Nebula, battlecruisers with hulls thick enough to shrug off stellar flares, carrier ships loaded with fighter swarms, siege platforms that could crack a planet's crust, and at the center of it all, the Velith hegemony's flagship, the Throne of Ixchera, a vessel so massive it had its own gravitational field. Warlord Ixchera stood on the command bridge of her flagship and looked out at the assembled fleet and felt the warm satisfaction of overwhelming force, because this was how problems were solved in the galaxy. You gathered enough ships and enough firepower, and you made the problem go away. The humans have 12 ships at Tyralos, she told her commanders. Their homeworld is defended by nothing but a Dyson swarm and whatever scraps they left behind. We will arrive. We will destroy their infrastructure. We will reduce their world to glass, and we will end this before it begins. Her commanders agreed because her commanders always agreed, and the fleet jumped to FTL, and the stars blurred and 14,000 ships raced toward Sol with murder in their hearts. The journey took 6 hours. When they arrived, they found exactly what their intelligence had predicted: Sol's system, the yellow star dimmed by its Dyson swarm, the small blue planet called Earth hanging in space like a jewel, and no fleet, no defense stations, no orbital weapons platforms, no minefield, nothing. Just silence. Ixchera felt the first cold finger of doubt touch the back of her mind, but she pushed it away because she had 14,000 ships and the humans had none, and numbers did not lie. All ships advance to bombardment range, she commanded. Target the Dyson swarm first, destroy their power source, and they are nothing. The fleet moved forward in perfect formation, a wall of metal and energy that darkened the stars behind it, and they crossed the outer boundary of Sol's system and kept going, and nothing happened. They passed the orbit of the outermost planet, and nothing happened. They reached the halfway point between the outer system and Earth, and nothing happened. And then everything happened. It began with the navigation systems. Every ship in the fleet reported the same error at the same moment, a cascade of warnings that said the stars were in the wrong positions, that the fundamental constants used for FTL calculations had changed, that the equations that governed faster-than-light travel no longer produced valid results. The fleet's chief navigator contacted the Throne of Ixchera in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm and said, "Warlord, our FTL drives are not malfunctioning. The drives are operating correctly, but the rules they operate under have changed. I do not know how to explain this." Ixchera ordered a diagnostic, and the diagnostic came back clean, and she ordered another one, and it came back clean too, and she was about to order a third when the communications officer reported that all external communications had ceased. Not jammed, ceased. Their transmitters were working perfectly, their signals were broadcasting at full power, but the signals were not going anywhere, as if the space around them had become a wall that nothing could pass through. And then the stars went wrong. Every viewport on every ship in the fleet showed the same impossible thing. The familiar constellations of the galaxy, the landmarks that every species used for navigation, were shifting, slowly and subtly but unmistakably, as if someone was rewriting the sky itself. It was not the stars that were moving. It was the space between them. In the bowels of the Throne of Ixchera, the ship's chief physicist, a Velith scientist named Keth who had spent her career studying the fundamental structure of spacetime, ran every test she could think of, and then sat down heavily on the floor of her laboratory and said a word that roughly translated as impossible. "The metric has changed," she told Ixchera when she was summoned to the bridge, and her voice was hollow with shock. "The underlying mathematical structure that governs how space and time behave, someone has altered it within a defined radius around this star system. FTL travel, long-range communication. Even certain types of sensor technology rely on specific values within that metric being constant. Those values are no longer constant. Ixchara stared at her and said, "What are you telling me?" "I am telling you that we are inside a cage," Keth said. "And the cage is not made of metal or energy. It is made of physics. Someone has changed the rules of the universe in this region of space, and our technology no longer works the way it should because our technology was built for a universe with different rules." The bridge was silent. "Who could do this?" Ixchara whispered. "Nobody," Keth said. "Nobody should be able to do this." But somebody had, and they all knew who. The broadcast came exactly 1 hour after the fleet's systems had gone dark. A single transmission on a frequency that should not have been able to reach them, but did, because the humans had written the new rules, and the new rules said their signals could pass through just fine. Rayan Nadu's face appeared on every screen on every ship in the fleet, and he was sitting in a comfortable chair with a cup of tea, and he looked calm and perhaps a little sad. "I want you to know that we are not going to fire on you," he said. "Not today, not ever. We did not build this technology to destroy, and we did not build it to conquer." He paused and took a sip of his tea. "We built a door," he said, "and we are the lock right now. You are inside our house, and the door is closed, and nothing enters or leaves without our permission. Your weapons still work. Your life support still works. Your conventional engines still work. You can fly around this system all you like, but you cannot leave, and you cannot call for help, and you will not be able to until we open the door." The fleet's tactical officers immediately tested this claim and confirmed it. Weapons still fired, engines still burned, but FTL was dead. Communications beyond Sol system were dead, and they were trapped as thoroughly as if they had been sealed in a bottle. "You have two choices," Rayan continued. "You can sit here and wait and be angry, and you can blame us for what we have done, and that is your right, or you can agree to talk, and we will open the door and you can go home. We want you to go home. We want you to go home and tell the conquered what you have seen here, because what comes next matters to everyone, not just humanity." He smiled, and it was the same smile he had given the Grand Assembly, the smile of someone who knew something enormous. "Take your time," he said. "We are patient. We have been patient for 42 years. We can wait a little longer." The transmission ended. Ixchara stood on her bridge surrounded by the most powerful fleet in galactic history and felt something she had never felt before, not anger, not fear, but a kind of awe that was close to reverence, because she was a warrior and she understood power. And what the humans had done was not just powerful, it was absolute. For 11 days, the fleet drifted in Sol system, and the crews grew restless, and arguments broke out between the coalition species. And some captains wanted to attack Earth out of desperation, and others wanted to surrender immediately. And Ixchara held them together through sheer force of will while she wrestled with the reality of her situation. On the 11th day, she ordered a channel open to the human frequency, and she said, "We agree to talk." The door opened. The FTL drives came back online as if nothing had happened. The communication systems reconnected to the galactic network, and the stars returned to their proper positions, and the fleet was free. A single human ship escorted them to the edge of Sol system, and as the throne of Ixchara prepared to jump, the escort ship sent one final message. A young human lieutenant, barely old enough to hold her rank, appeared on screen and said, "Warlord Ixchara, before you go, we wanted to offer you some tea for the journey home." Ixchara stared at the screen for a long moment, and then did something that shocked her entire bridge crew. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh or a bitter laugh, but a real laugh. The laugh of someone who has been beaten so completely and so elegantly that there is nothing left to do but admire it. "Keep your tea, little human," she said, and there was respect in her voice that had not been there before. The coalition fleet jumped away, and the story of what had happened in Sol's system spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and the Conquered watched and listened, and tried to understand what it meant. And on Tyrolo's station, old Sithar accessed the classified Conquered archives for the first time in his career, pulling strings and calling in favors he had saved for decades, and he searched for something he had only heard whispered about: the precursor files. The ancient records left behind by the species that had built the galaxy's first infrastructure 12,000 years ago, before vanishing without explanation. He found what he was looking for in a file that had never been translated because no one had understood its context, and when he read it, the scales on his body went cold. It was a predictive model, a mathematical framework designed to identify a specific type of species, a species that was creative and stubborn and driven by adversity, a species that would not simply use the tools of the universe but would learn to reshape the tools themselves. The precursors had a name for this type of species. The translation was rough, but the closest rendering in Conquered Standard was a single word: locksmiths. And the model matched humanity exactly. The vote was unanimous. Not because every species agreed willingly, and not because every delegate was happy, but because the coalition fleet had come home with empty weapons and full hearts, and a story that changed everything. And because when 14,000 warships cannot scratch a species that offers you tea instead of death, you do not vote no. Humanity was granted full Tier 1 membership in the Galactic Conquered, the highest classification ever given to a species that had been Tier 9 within living memory, and a permanent seat on the ruling council with full veto authority, and the formalities were completed in a single session because nobody wanted to drag it out. The Apes with Engines broadcast was quietly removed from every server and archive in the galactic network, and the Velith hegemony issued a formal apology that was broadcast on every channel, and Thavan, ancient and humbled, personally welcomed Rayan Nadu to the council chamber and gave him the seat at the right hand of the presiding table, which was traditionally reserved for the most honored member. But everyone knew the real moment was still coming. The final term. Rayan had promised to reveal it after the vote, and now the vote was done and the Grand Assembly was full again, every seat taken, every species present, and the silence was not the mocking silence of 42 years ago. It was the silence of a galaxy holding its breath. Rayan stood at the central platform and looked up at the assembled faces: insectoid, reptilian, crystalline, gaseous, aquatic, silicon, carbon, and 100 other forms of life that the universe had dreamed into existence. And he took a moment to simply stand there and feel the weight of what he was about to say. "When we went silent 42 years ago," he began, "we did not do it out of spite, although there was spite in us. We did it because we found something that scared us more than your laughter ever did." He activated a display that filled the center of the hall with a three-dimensional map of the Milky Way, every star system rendered in light, every known civilization marked and labeled, and it was beautiful, the entire galaxy laid out like a garden of light. Then he zoomed out. The map expanded to show the space beyond the galaxy, the vast dark gulf between the Milky Way and its nearest neighbors, and in that darkness, something was moving. It appeared first as a scattering of red points, barely visible against the void, and then the display enhanced them, and the red points became shapes, and the shapes became ships, and the ships became a number that the display struggled to render. 412 billion vessels, Rayan said quietly, spread across a wave front approximately 2,000 light-years wide, moving toward our galaxy at 0.7% of light speed. They have been traveling for approximately 60,000 years, and based on their current trajectory, they will reach the outer edge of the Milky Way in 300 years. The hall was so still that it felt like time had stopped. "We have been studying them for 31 years, Rayan continued, using sensors powered by our Dyson swarm and enhanced by our lockstep technology, What we have found is this. They are not explorers, they are not traders, they are not refugees, they are a consumption wave, an armada from a neighboring galaxy that strips civilizations of their resources and their people and their worlds and moves on. They have done this before, to at least 7 other galaxies that we can detect, and they will do it to ours. He let the silence hold for a long moment. This is what the precursors knew, he said. This is why they vanished. They did not die and they did not transcend. They saw what was coming, and they ran, and before they ran, they left something behind. Sithar, sitting in the gallery with his old heart pounding, leaned forward. They left the theoretical framework for the technology we now call lockstep, Rayan said, buried in their archives, hidden inside files that nobody had ever fully decoded, because the mathematics required to understand it did not exist yet. The precursors could not build it themselves. Their minds did not work the way it required. But they knew that eventually, somewhere in the galaxy, a species would arise that could. He paused. A species that was stubborn enough and creative enough and angry enough to look at the fundamental rules of the universe and say, "No, I think we will change those." A murmur moved through the hall. The precursors had a name for that kind of species, Rayan said. They called them locksmiths, beings who could build doors where there were none and locks where there were no doors. And they left their archives behind as a gift, a seed, a hope that someday the locksmiths would arrive and do what the precursors could not. He looked around the hall, and his dark eyes were steady and calm, and full of something that was not pride but was close to it. "We are the locksmiths," he said, "and here is our final term." He raised one hand, and the galactic map shifted, and the lockstep field that currently surrounded Sol's system was highlighted. A small bubble of altered spacetime, 50 light-years across, surrounding humanity's home star. "We will extend this field," Rayan said. "Not just around Sol, around everything. Every star, every world, every station, every ship, every civilization in the Milky Way. We will wrap this galaxy in a wall that nothing can breach, and we will lock the stars behind us, all of us together. And when the wave arrives in 300 years, it will find a door that cannot be opened and a lock that cannot be broken." He let his hand fall. "That is our final term, not power, not authority, not revenge, protection. We want to protect you, all of you, every species that laughed at us and every species that did not, because that is what locksmiths do. They do not tear down doors, they build them and they stand behind them, and they keep what is inside safe." The silence lasted for 10 seconds, and then the Rithani collective, the ancient crystal beings who had spoken only twice in 300 years, rose from their seats and activated every translation matrix they had, and they broadcast a single word in every language known to the conquered. The word was yes. And then the Dreven delegation rose, and the Outer Rim colonies rose, and the gas giant civilizations rose, and one by one, species by species, the entire Grand Assembly stood, and Thavan stood, and even the Velith stood, and the hall was full of beings who had once laughed at humanity and were now standing in silence because there were no words adequate for what they felt. In the gallery, Sithar was weeping. The tears ran down his old scaled face, and he did not bother to wipe them away because he finally understood what he had sensed 42 years ago when he looked at Kavya Naidu's eyes and saw a promise. It was not a promise of vengeance, and it was not a promise of conquest. It was a promise of protection. He had not been detecting a threat. He had been detecting a guardian. The expansion of the lockstep field began 1 year later. It grew outward from Sol like a ripple in a pond, spreading at a speed that should not have been possible, passing through star systems, and wrapping them in a shell of altered spacetime that sealed them inside a bubble where the rules of physics were set by human hands. The conquered scientists worked alongside human engineers, learning, adapting, helping where they could, and the galaxy watched as the field grew, sector by sector, arm by arm, a wave of invisible change that swept across the Milky Way like a tide. On Earth, in a hospital room in Accra, an old man named Emeka Osei lay in a bed with tubes in his arms and monitors beeping softly around him, and he watched the field's progress on a view screen that his granddaughter had set up so he could see. He had given 40 years of his life to this moment, and his body was failing, but his mind was still sharp. And he tracked the field's expansion with the quiet satisfaction of an architect watching the final brick being laid. His granddaughter, a young engineer named Amma, sat beside him and held his hand and told him that the field had just passed the Orion Arm's outer boundary, and Emeka nodded and smiled. "How much longer?" he asked. 6 hours, Amma said. He nodded again and settled back against his pillows and watched the screen. 6 hours later, the field reached the outer edge of the Milky Way and closed. The entire galaxy, every star, every world, every civilization, every ship, every living being was sealed inside a wall of rewritten physics that no external force could penetrate, and the lockstep field hummed with the quiet power of a door that had been shut and locked and bolted. Emeka watched the completion indicator turn green, and he let out a long, slow breath, and he said, "Door is locked, porch light is on, let them come." Amma squeezed his hand and smiled through her tears, and Emeka closed his eyes, and he was at peace. 300 years passed. The Milky Way changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Species that had been enemies for millennia became allies. Civilizations that had stagnated found new purpose, and humanity did not rule the galaxy because they had never wanted to rule it. They simply stood at the door and kept watch and drank their tea and waited. And then the wave arrived. 412 billion ships spread across 2,000 light years, a tide of destruction that had consumed 7 galaxies and had never been stopped. And they reached the outer edge of the Milky Way, and they scanned for weaknesses. They probed the field with weapons that could crack planets. The field held. They bombarded it with energy that could ignite stars. The field held. They threw everything they had at it for 50 years, an unrelenting assault that would have overwhelmed any conventional defense in the known universe. The field held. And inside the galaxy, a civilization that had spent 300 years preparing for this moment watched the assault on their shields and felt not fear but something close to pity for the beings outside who had traveled so far to find a door they could not open. On the 301st year, the assault stopped. The wave had exhausted its options, and for the first time in its long and terrible history, it had found something it could not consume. A single transmission was sent outward through the field, because the locksmiths could send signals through their own door even if nothing could come in. And it was broadcast in every language the wave had ever encountered, and in every language the Milky Way had ever spoken, and in 1,000 others that humanity had invented just for this moment. It was not a warning, and it was not a threat, and it was not a declaration of victory. It was 2 words. Go home. The wave lingered for another year, scanning, probing, searching for any crack in the wall that the apes with engines had built around their galaxy. There were no cracks. And slowly, over the course of a decade, 412 billion ships turned away from the Milky Way and moved on, searching for easier prey among the distant galaxies, leaving behind a civilization that had been saved by the very species it had once mocked. Inside the galaxy, on a station that orbited a world in the Dreven Republic, there was a museum dedicated to interspecies history, and in that museum there was a room dedicated to humanity, and in that room there was a plaque on the wall, and on the plaque were words that Sithar had written before he died, words that had become the most famous sentence in galactic history. The plaque read, "They laughed at the apes. The apes locked the galaxy behind a door and stood guard for eternity. Nobody is laughing now. Nobody ever will again." And far away, on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. A species that had once been nothing more than a punchline sat in their gardens and their cities and their homes, and they drank their tea and watched the stars through the door they had built, and they were not afraid. They had never been afraid. They had only ever been angry, and then they had been busy, and now they were something that the galaxy had never thought to call them. They were home, and the door was locked, and the porch light was on, and nothing was getting in.